In this video, you're going to find my best suggestion on how to easily identify intervals by ear. This is because many musicians are asking me this question, but if you're familiar with my channel, you surely know that I'm not a big fan of intervals. There are good reasons why it is. I think there are far more effective and better approaches to ear training than intervals, and this is actually not my opinion. It's also backed up by science and by tons of students. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, please stay until the end of the video. That said, if you're not familiar with my channel and don't know who I am, which is pretty normal, I would say I am Leonardo Caminati, and I am a musician, a music producer. I teach about ear training also. I've developed a method that's called Use Your Ear, and it's the only ear training method that's based on scientific foundations. It's also the only method, as far as I know, that teaches ear training focusing only on developing a refined sense of pitch. The method is a very gradual process that takes you from not being able to match pitch, which is the most basic skill ever, to recognizing songs by ear, recognizing chords, melodies, improvising, developing a more refined sense of intonation. And this is achieved through a carefully laid out series of exercises that aim to gradually familiarize you with musical feelings like tension, resolution, happiness, sadness, and everything in between. And after you have become familiar with these feelings, you can gradually start to recognize them in real music, in real melodies, in real chord progressions, etc. You can also imagine them and recall them and know what they are while you're thinking of them. This is achieved by not practicing intervals at all. I actually discourage students to practice intervals for many reasons. Again, I'll tell you more about later. Actually, surprisingly enough, students are also happy about the results they get, and we have many videos showcasing the improvements that our students get, the development of their ability to recognize chord progressions, melodies, musical memory, and many other skills. The course indeed is rated as excellent on Trustpilot by our students with a 4.5 out of 5 score. I guess that's enough as an introduction for the Use Your Ear method. It's time to talk about the topic we have at hand today, which is how to easily identify intervals by ear. Well, it might seem counterintuitive at first to some of you, but here it is. Basically, it's about framing each interval into a key, into a scale. What I mean by that, let's say this interval is played. Pum, pum. If you don't know what this interval is, my advice is for you to start framing a scale around these two intervals. The best way is to consider the lowest note as the tonic of a key. So, da, da, da. This is a scale, a portion of a major scale that starts, in my mind, starts from the third degree and then lands on the 1. So 3, 2, 1. I've just recognized this is a major third by using this strategy. You can do the same whatever interval is played, basically. You can either include it in a major scale, in a minor scale, if you're thinking about a major scale, but the interval is not included in that major scale, because maybe it's a minor sixth interval, and so it's not included in a major scale if the first note is the tonic. Well, you will just sing until you arrive to the fifth, and then you'll hear that there's going to be a semitone interval, like a minor second between the fifth degree and the target note of the interval. Basically, the only interval that you have to learn is the minor second. Any other interval that you may ever recognize is either a note of the major scale or a note that's half a step above or below a note of the major scale. So this will cover actually every possible interval. If you just know the major scale and you know the minor second interval, you can cover every interval. You can recognize every interval. So I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, oh, this is kind of quirky. It's not really, it doesn't make sense to me, right? I understand that. But here's the very important reason why I suggest you do follow this process, especially if you can't recognize intervals yet. First reason is that our perception of pitch is tonal. So this means that each note or interval or chord is going to assume a different feeling depending on the role it assumes inside the key that's established by the song, or that is established in your mind, because we can establish keys in your mind on an abstract level without being aware consciously of it. So what happens is that in general, in music, we can only recognize notes, chords, intervals by relying on the feeling they have. If you don't follow this process and you're not experienced enough, when you listen to an interval and you try to recognize and think of a million different things in order to recognize it, what happens is that you actually start shifting the key in the back of your mind. So you start that you're framing that interval in a different key, and that interval assumes a very specific sensation. It could be a sensation of rest, for example, in the major third interval I just sang a minute ago. The moment you start thinking of a lot of different things, of a lot of like beginnings of songs and whatever, your mind starts shifting the key or blurring the key. So what happens? You're not really perceiving the interval having the same feeling as it did initially. So you're actually confusing your mind, basically. You're confusing yourself. It's like trying to recognize the color of a piece of paper that constantly changes color. It's basically madness, okay? So it will drive you crazy. So always having a reference scale, always having a tonic that's your reference every time you recognize an interval actually stabilizes the feeling on the interval itself. That's because you stabilize the key in your mind. So if you actually sing a scale, you establish a very clear perception of a very specific key. Thus, that interval is going to assume a stable feeling, and you're not going to get confused by that interval actually changing feeling suddenly because you're thinking of a million different things. You have a very simple thing to do, like frame a key, sing a scale, and find out where each note of the interval lands in relation to that scale. With time, you will be able to more quickly and easily establish a key, and this process is going to become faster and faster. That said, there are other reasons why following this procedure is important, I think. If you adopt the scale as a framework to recognize music, you're going to be able to apply this framework to any song you're going to listen to. Complex song might have key shifts, might modulate to a key and then come back to the previous key later on, might include non-diatonic notes and chords. But at any given time, in any of the songs you listen to, there's going to be a main key established. So if you use the key as a framework, you have the key to recognize all the songs you'll listen to and to develop an intuitive connection to music. Indeed, by following this process, you're going to either develop or reinforce the ability to sing the scale and also to recognize notes in relation to a scale. In other words, to recognize scale degrees. These are the true backbones of a great musical ear. It's not about intervals, it's about tonality, key, scales, scale degrees, degrees of the chords, and these things. People who have a great musical ear can recognize these things, can work out and recognize songs, melodies, chords by using these things before getting to intervals. Indeed, if you can't sing the scale yet, I would actually discourage you from practicing interval-based exercises, because it's proven, not only by my experience and the experience of my students, but also by rigorous scientific studies, that intervals are actually counterproductive at that stage of the learning process. There are more important and foundational skills to be developed before actually practicing intervals. And if you skip these foundational skills, not only you won't learn to identify intervals by ear, you will also prevent other skills, important skills, to develop. I'm not kidding. It sounds like it's a dangerous thing to practice intervals. Indeed, it is. Kind of, you're not going to get hurt, but you're going to get frustrated. You're going to be overwhelmed, and you're going to be demotivated if you're not ready to do it yet. You can learn more about this at the end of this video. Now let's go on, and then I'll give you some links to other videos where I explain everything in detail about every little bad thing I'm saying about intervals. I see that there's a widely common issue where a lot of students are actually trying to recognize simple tonal chord progressions and simple tonal melodies, which means melodies and chord progression in one single key without non-diatonic note, without key shifts, without anything, like simple tonal music, by forcing themselves to recognize these melodies and chords thinking interval by interval. So for example, they try to recognize the melody by recognizing the interval from the first to the second note of the melody, then the interval from the second to the third note, then the interval from the third to the fourth, and so on. It's very painful to watch because you actually don't need to apply that process, that thought process, in order to recognize a simple tonal melody. It's honestly a bad habit to do that, because simple tonal melodies are easy to recognize if you have the ability to recognize scale degrees, which is much faster, much more intuitive, much easier. I mean, much everything than recognizing a melody interval by interval. Same for chord progressions. So if you're doing this, just know that you don't need to do this. And if you're doing this, I would discourage you to do this and try a tonal approach instead. This is why our method is perfect, I think, for beginner and intermediate students, because it solves all of these little issues in a gradual way and in a proven way, which is being used by thousands of musicians up to now. I would say intervals might be useful when there are a lot of key shifts and you're trying to deal with very advanced harmony, like super advanced jazz. That's where you want to use more interval-based thought processes. But if you're interested in the most common musical genres like pop, rock, folk, and other simple kind of musical style other than super advanced jazz and fusion, and maybe also like complex classical music, it doesn't make sense to use intervals as a main strategy. You're making things difficult for no reasons, literally. Indeed, a lot of those students, when we start working together, it's enough to say them, okay, now let's do this. Think of the scale, try to recognize scale degrees, and they can recognize the same melody like immediately, almost immediately. So not all students are like that, but students who already have a background of tonal skills and are not using them, they just make a quantum leap in a second. To summarize this, I would say that I would use intervals the least as possible if you are a beginner or intermediate student who is trying to deal with simple tonal music at first, as it should be. You are not going to succeed in recognizing chord progression and melodies that are so complicated that require thinking of intervals if you are a beginner or intermediate student. So it doesn't really make sense, and there's no advantage in that strategy. In case you have exams or auditions that require you to identify intervals by ear, I would apply the strategy I've shared at the beginning of this video. And of course, let me know in the comments if it works, if it helps. I'm quite confident it's going to help because I've seen a lot of people applying it and finding it helpful. That being said, I'm very curious about an important thing. I'd really like to know what's the goal that you expect to achieve by learning to identify intervals by ear. What's your hope? What do you hope to achieve with that? Is it just learning chords and notes by ear, recognizing music by ear, or passing an exam, an audition where you're required to pass an interval identification test. What is that? Why are you so interested in learning to identify intervals by ear? Please drop a comment in the comment section below. So if you want to dig deeper into this topic and understand all the specific reasons and know all the scientific findings behind why interval-based exercises are counterproductive for beginner and intermediate students while they are useful to advanced students, please check out this video up here. I'm confident you'll find it very helpful and interesting.